guys, welcome to That Pedal Show. Dan here.
Hello, Mick here.
Today we're looking at...
Hang on.
Sorry.
My phone's ringing. Hello? It's Taylor Swift.
Oh, how's she doing?
She says... Really? Oh, come on. Okay, I'll tell him, but... She says...
She's cancelled tonight, right?
If we don't do a video on using effects in the loop and into the front of the amp, she's never watching That Pedal Show again.
Really? Okay, well, fair enough. This one's for Taylor.
Hang on, hang on. What now?
Tell us she still owes me 10 quid.
You still owe him 10 quid. Okay. What, never, ever, ever? Getting back together? Never? Okay, all right.
So, we're looking at using effects in the effects loop of an amplifier.
Right, we're doing this because in previous videos that we've done, in the comments, thank you very much for all the comments you leave, by the way. It really helps us decide what we're going to do next. So that's where we get our ideas from. A few people have commented and said, look, you're running all the delays and reverbs into the front of the amp. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about why you might want to use them in the loop and why you might want to run them in the front of the amp? Mm-hmm. So here we are.
Yeah, so effects loops, amplifier effects loops. They're all different. If your amplifier has one, none of them are the same. And you end up having to tweak them all a bit differently. But the idea is that your guitar will go into the preamp, the front end of the amplifier, and that's where you have your EQ section and the pre-volume gain, you know, the gain that gives you the overdrive of the amplifier. So there's your preamp. Then it goes from the preamp through what we call an effects send, and then the signal goes out into your delay and reverb and those effects that you want to go into the effects loop of the amplifier. And then from there it goes back to the effects return, and then it gets plugged into the power amp. So like the master volume section will control the power amp. It's easiest if you think of it like this. Think of your preamp as another effects pedal. All right, and what you're doing is you're putting that preamp and where you want it in the signal path. Okay. There are some pedals that sound great before the preamp, and some pedals that sound great after the preamp. You know, it's just trial and error to see which ones that you like. But as a general rule,
we love general rule.
Overdrive pedals, gain-based effects pedals, into the front of the amplifier, pretty much every time. Then delays and reverbs, time-based effects, in the effects loop of the amplifier, after the gain section. Modulation, personally, I much prefer it into the front. I think it has a much better vibe going to the front of the amplifier. Mm. But some guys like their phases and choruses and things in the loop. That's a sort of, it's the only grey area, really, yep. But I would say in the front.
Yeah. So this is all assuming that your guitar amp has an effects loop, of course, because exactly. not every guitar amp has an effects loop. So the reason we brought this along today, Victory V40, is because it has a loop, whereas the amps that we normally use don't.
They don't. I mean, for me, like Dave Gilmour has never used an effects loop. He plugs in the front. You know, good enough for Dave, good enough for me. The thing with effects loop is they have their issues. So, for example, the preamp sound that you get from here, you've got to send that preamp out of a cable, you know, back to your pedals and then back through a cable. So you're actually taking that entire lovely valve goodness and then sending that to your board and then, you know, putting it back to the amplifier. So just those cable runs, they present their own problems.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because right at the top of the video, Daniel said that not all effects loops are created equal, and that exactly. Is absolutely true. You know, in some amps, particularly more cost-effective amps, the loop is probably something that's there to encourage you to buy it. You know, it's a thing that looks good in the store, on the spec list. Is it the most beautifully engineered audiophile effects loop out there with a nice send and return? Maybe not.
Yeah, and that has a lot to do with the impedance of the effects send. So what happens is if your preamp doesn't have a low enough impedance, every foot of cable that you get from the send to the board, you do end up losing tone, which is why guys, you know, they get everything set up with the preamp and then they just unplug it. It's like, oh, hang on, it sounds a bit different. That's generally what's going on there. But, you know, sometimes it sounds great. So let's have a listen. This is just the amp by itself. So the amplifier is set up. The amplifier is set up with the. It's not set up to be really clean. It's set up to have a little bit of dirt going. So the front end. Just a hair of compression. Okay. So if we have a look at just an overdrive into the front end, you get this sound. Now if we add some delay. The reverb. Now you hear audiophile is a good word to use. It's almost studio-like because what's happening is you're getting all of the reverb and all of the delay. That signal is going directly into the power amplifier. Okay, so. Pretty.
So just to recap there, you've got the overdrive hitting the front of the amplifier.
Exactly.
And the reverb and delay in the loop.
Exactly.
So the reverb and delay aren't touching the front end of the amp at all.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. They're being fed from the preamp section of the amplifier and then going back to the power amplifier. Now if we take that exact same sound, so how I set G2 up in the next bang is I've now got the effects loop after the reverb. So I go to effects loop 2. So then we. And you hear it's a little bit more compressed. You're not getting the shimmeriness. Now, personally, I like that. If you go directly into the front end, it adds a bit of that front end compression from those first valve stages.
Definitely, when you were playing, and I hope this comes through on the audio that we're capturing today, with the pedals in the loop, the sound was cleaner, brighter. I heard more attack on the front end of the note. And the guitar itself just sounded clearer, and the effects sounded somehow adding to that. When the effects were in the front of the amp, it just felt a little bit more kind of muddled together, for want of a better description.
Yeah, and of course we're using, so the two effects we have in the loop, the timeline and the big sky, they work great in an effects loop. It's different if you have effects that don't work very well in the effects loop. You know what I mean? So it all comes down to... They
also have a great analog signal path as well, don't they?
Exactly.
So if we were using lesser pedals, something that was 100% digital processed all the way through the pedal, that's probably not going to sound tremendously good in the front of the amp. I mean, it's probably not going to sound tremendously good anyway, but...
The thing is, it's not saying that you can't design a digital pedal that doesn't sound very good.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean
I'm just saying they haven't yet.
Yeah.
You know? No, for me,
and they're all used by girl singers.
God, let's work that one.
Hang on. Oh no, it's not Taylor Swift again.
For me, and knowing what to do about an analog signal, it makes huge sense to keep the dry signal analog.
Yeah.
Now that also, with some effects loops, you have this blend thing, which can work. So for example, if we used the kill dry in these and turned off the dry signal path, and then used the blend in the effects loop to blend in the affected signal, that can work great.
Yeah.
It does have issues though, if you kick in an effects pedal that doesn't have a kill dry on it,
Yep.
and the phase is inverted. You're blending in an out of phase direct signal. So
what we're delving into there is some of the more complicated bits of using loops, right?
Yeah.
What we're primarily interested in today is, what do these pedals sound like in the loop, and what do they sound like in the front of the amp?
What I think I might do actually, so we're going to turn up the preamp a bit. Now, because this is a single channel amplifier, you're probably not going to run with this sound or not. You want it set up so it's just on the verge of breakup. Setting it like this, we're going to hear more of a distinct difference. When you have like a 2-channel or 3-channel amplifier, we can set the preamp gains up to all manner of different things. Then it's a good idea to use the effects loop so that you can use the overdrive of those different sections of the amplifier. Okay, so let's imagine that this is like channel 2, the sort of grindy section of the amplifier.
So is there a general rule of thumb there that says the dirtier you're playing, the more likely you might be to want to run your delays and reverbs in the loop?
The dirtier that you're playing the preamp.
Yeah.
Yes, and yet, it's not a rule. For example, the Biffy Clyro, Simon Neil. I mean, he runs everything straight in the front, and his amps are cranked. I mean, he also puts delay in front of his overdrive pedal. It sounds huge, and it's a mess, but it's a calculated mess. It all depends on what you're going for. So, try these things out and see what works for you. And, you just might find something that you really connect with. So, yes, we've turned the preamp gain up. So this is the amplifier by itself. Now, if I go to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a sound in that has overdrive, delay, and reverb. The delay and reverb is going to be in the effects loop. Then I'm going to switch it and put the delay and reverb in the front. So first of all, we hear the delay and reverb in the effects loop. Now we'll hear it in the front. So you hear it's not as detailed, it's a bit more compressed.
We're going to do that again. We're going to play an overdriven sound, firstly with the delay and reverb in the loop, and secondly when you switch, the delay and reverb will be into the front of the amp.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay,
Do that.
so switch between those and let's...
Okay, so here we have the delay and reverb in the loop. It's just not as defined.
I'm hearing two things. I'm perceiving a level difference, but I think that might be because the sound of the pedals in the loop is just clearer.
It is. So what happens is when your pedals are going into the front, you get that front end compression. But when you get that preamp going through that and then it goes straight to the power amp is wide open. So, it receives whatever it's given, basically. It won't compress at all.
We should probably just explain as well. So G2 is controlling whether the pedals are going in the front or in the loop.
Exactly. So I've got the preamp put in G2's insert.
Yeah, okay.
And I can move that insert around.
Oh, I see. Right.
You have a go so that you can... it's also... You feel a difference with it as well.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go to... yeah, so we'll go the same thing for you. We'll have delay and reverb in the loop, and then I'm going to switch you over, and then you'll have delay and reverb going straight into the front.
Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so that's really interesting. What I was hearing was with the pedals in the loop, I'm getting more of the guitar's kind of hairy, high-end, that sort of thing you'd expect from a Strat bridge pickup.
Yep.
More definition in the notes, whereas, and that was particularly important on the neck pickup where I want that extra
Of course.
definition.
Because it can get a bit woolly. up
Yeah,
there.
yeah, particularly when you're using lots of gain with a single coil pickup. But then when they went into the front of the amp, everything just seemed to just tighten a little bit and close down, and there wasn't that breadth of... Just didn't have the definition
Of course.
of the note.
Yep, and that's the front end just compressing a bit more. I will say though, when you're playing at massive volume, you're getting compression from different areas of the amplifier. You're getting compression from the front end, you're getting compression from the power amplifier, you're getting compression from the speakers. So, you know, having that bit of extra dynamic range from in the loop is great, but when you get to you know, really cranking the amplifier up, you know, the differences are less acute, shall we say. You know, for me personally, I think I like having an amplifier with a single preamp, bang straight in the front, turn it up, it sounds great. That works for me, but for the guys, if you really want that clean, defined sound, I mean, you know, I've set up lots of effects loop amplifiers and they can sound amazing. I like the simplicity of the non-effects loop amplifiers, but you know, that's when effects loops can work great, when you want that big dynamic range, you know, and you've got, especially, this is a 40 watt amplifier, there's a certain amount of headroom that 40 watts will afford you, and it can sound great. Having an effects loop in like a 1 watt amplifier really isn't going to work, you know, because it's just compressing straight away in the power amp section. Yeah.
Right, so increasing the input gain on the amp is significant, isn't it? Because that's where using your loop really starts to make a difference.
Exactly. So like multi-channel amplifiers with separate preamps, for guys who want to use their preamps for their distortion, for their overdrive sound, effects loops are fantastic.
So a good example of that would be our friend Mr. Bonamassa again.
Yes.
So when he's using his Silver Jubilee rig, front end, well, that whole amp sounds great, but throwing a load of effects straight into the front of that amp is going to muddy that whole thing up. So he will just keep the front end as clean as possible, well, as dirty as possible, but as clean as possible in terms of effects, and run, I think one of his Silver Jubilees sits as his rhythm sound all the time.
Right.
And he's got a kind of delay in the loop of that amp.
All right.
Yeah. So it keeps it sounding crisper.
Right.
Which is to say, the more you use the front end distortion of your amp, the more you might want to think about using the loop.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Andy Timmons, another good example. Before he got his Angry Charlie, he was, you know, a big part of his sound was the preamp in his Lone Star. Lone Star, I believe, was the... Yeah,
well, he sometimes he uses the 2 channels of the Lone Star, sometimes he will use a Stiletto Ace, but either way, either way, he's using an amp that's dirty. He's using a dirty channel of an amp for some of his sounds.
But he runs everything into that, and the only thing he has in the loop is his delay. But now he's experimenting with just running everything into the front, and it sounds great. So, you know...
So with that in mind then, if you're not using distorted sounds and you're using predominantly clean sounds, I guess there's less complication about running all the stuff in the front. Plus you get the tonal character of the particular. So if you've got like a really lovely sounding warm analog delay, using a clean sound, you might prefer that way more in the front of the amp.
What I like about that is that the preamp and the paramp signal, they all stay together. You know, they're not being fed externally, where there are other factors that can complicate things. It keeps things simple.
Okay, let's hear some clean sounds then, just out of interest. So I'll put the input down, switch over to voice 1 because there's less gain in voice 1.
So, with some delay and reverb. Now, if we hear that sound that was in the loop, now this is with it in the front.
The differences are nowhere near as marked, but I can, sat right next to the amp, I can hear it. I can still hear that it's kind of more crystalline in the loop and slightly more, slightly less crystalline going into the front of the amp. Now there might be times where that's what you want.
Exactly.
You don't want all that chime and sparkle. You want it to kind of muddy up a little bit, especially with analog delays like we were saying earlier, right?
Yep, because they have a character, you know, when they're going to the front of an amplifier, that there's a character there, you know. And a lot of analog delays don't work very well in effects loops.
What it's saying to me is it's just another tiny way, but significant way of just understanding how to get what you need.
Yeah.
So it might be that if you're not getting quite enough definition off your notes when you're using Drive, try it in the loop. If everything sounds a little bit sterile and clean and well defined, try it in the front end.
Sure.
It's having that kind of extra tiny bit of knowledge that just helps you go, okay, I don't need to buy another pedal here, or I don't need to buy another amp or change the pickups in my guitar. I can literally just shift a few things around and things might get more to my liking. Yeah.
The other thing is you will set your pedals up differently, whether in the loop or in the front end, you know. Because the front end is compressing, especially with delays, because the front end is compressing, you're going to hear more of that delay repeat. So you might end up turning the delay down a bit. But if it's in the loop, then you can have quite a lot of effect, but you're still getting all of that original preamp note in there. So, you know, it's just got to try these things out.
One last thing that people are going to probably ask about is using the wet signal only in the loop. Now, if you want to do that, you need a specific kind of effects loop,
exactly.
Right?
So you need a parallel effects loop. So a loop that can run an effects loop in parallel, so alongside of the preamp sound. So what will happen is you've got your preamp section, your power amp section, and it will still be connected. It will run a separate effects loop, and it will blend that effects loop on top of this signal. So that's when you set up the kill dry on your, you know, if your pedals would need to have kill dry, otherwise you have phase issues. But you know, for delay and reverb with kill dry, for example, what the Strymons have, you know, it can work fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that while there are amps out there with parallel effects loops, quite a few amps, most effects loops are just straight series. The whole thing goes through.
Just all that is a disconnect point. You know, like a break point between the preamp and the PAMP. It's a loop. Exactly. Exactly. When Howard Dumble invented his Dumbleator, that was specifically to use with his Dumble amplifiers, to give it so they could use the effects loop. Without it, the impedance is all messed up, and you know. But the Dumbleator sends a nice low impedance signal out to the effects, and then and parallel, so you can blend it in.
And if you don't have $25,000 to spend on an amp and another $10,000 on the Dumbleator and another, if you just don't have that cash lying around,
right?
So lots of people we know will use buffers in the loop. They might even use a boost in the loop.
Yes.
If they're using something in the loop that's got a very low level or just needs a little tweak up. Some people even use boosts in the loop to just tweak up the whole sound of the amp a bit. So.
Yeah. It's an EP boost, for example, can work really well in a loop. You know, using a booster in the loop for a solo boost can also be brilliant. It won't affect the gain structure going into the amplifier, but it gives it an overall volume boost going into the power amp.
One louder.
It's one louder in it. Yeah. So effects loops can be very handy, very handy. Well, okay, I hope that helped.
Yeah, what can we summarize? Because it's so nuanced, and even sitting here in the room, you can clearly hear and feel the differences. What have we learned? Do you ever run an overdrive and distortion in the loop of your amp?
I would say no.
I would say no. Let's just not even get into it.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
It's not that you can't do it. It's just it's going to give you some very unusual results, which. Yeah, so probably not. Let's not do that.
Let's go for probably not.
Yeah, probably not. Modulations, maybe. Depends what pedal it is. Reverbs and delays, those are the ones that you see in the loop most regularly, aren't they?
They work great. Now, some choruses and modulations, they can work great. The other thing that we didn't really touch on that I need to say is that some effects pedals are built for amplifier effects loops and some aren't. You've got two different signal levels. You've got your guitar signal level and you've got your line level. And the preamp send is a line level. So it's a much bigger level. And a lot of guitar effects pedals simply won't handle that amount of level.
Unless they've got some sort of input buffer.
Well, unless they're designed to handle it.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need a pad switch on there. So I mean, there's no pad switch on the Strymons, but they take your guitar signal, great. They take your line level, great. You know, some like the Eventide's got a pad switch on there specifically for a line level, and you know, but like my old Phase 90, you stick that in the effects loop and it just sounds horrible. It's not designed to go in an effects loop.
How could you find that information out?
It's tough, trial and error, really. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to what you want, you know.
Yeah, pedals sound different in the loop than they do
sound different in the loop.
in the front of your amp.
Yep.
So try both, see which you prefer, and go with that.
Definitely.
We would say, would we?
Yeah,
Is that
I
a
would
cop-out?
say. No, it's appropriate. Cheers, guys. Hope that was helpful, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.